June 6, 1944. It's 5 a.m. at Crisbecq Battery on the Normandy coast. Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen holds binoculars that tremble slightly as he scans the horizon, and what he sees will stay with him for the rest of his life. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he witnesses something that contradicts everything the High Command promised. The English Channel, the protective moat shielding the Third Reich's western flank, has turned into a steel highway. An endless armada of ships stretches from one horizon to the other, their dark shapes merging into a massive wall of approaching doom. Now let's talk numbers. This invasion force wasn't just big, it was unprecedented. We're talking 6,939 vessels total, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 support ships, and 864 merchant vessels. More than 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied countries were manning these ships. At 5:52 a.m., Ohmsen's battery got the order to open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., the first shells from their 210 mm Czech-made Skoda cannons arced toward the fleet. But honestly, it was like throwing drops of water at a tsunami. His battery targeted the U.S. cruisers USS Tuscaloosa, USS Quincy, and the battleship USS Nevada. Then, at 6:30 a.m., their guns took down the destroyer USS Corey, the only U.S. destroyer lost on D-Day. From his reinforced concrete observation post atop Crisbecq Battery, this 32-year-old naval officer became the first German defender to spot and engage the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. But what Ohmsen saw through his Zeiss rangefinder that morning wasn't just a fleet. It was proof that Nazi propaganda had lied. Allied industrial capacity was real, and it was massive. The math of defeat was sailing toward him at 8 knots. And this was just the start. Within hours, German officers all across Normandy would see this display of Allied industrial power, and it would shatter every assumption they had about their enemy. The end of Hitler's thousand-year Reich was beginning. The night before, June 5th, had already given warning signs. 50 miles from the coast, at Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel since April 15, 1944, was monitoring increasingly worrying reports. Rommel himself was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced the weather was too bad for an invasion. Then, at 1:20 a.m., the 7th Army got word of massive parachute drops across Normandy. Over 13,000 men from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were being flown in on Douglas C-47 Skytrains. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps from his headquarters in Saint-Lô, knew right away what this meant. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd lost a leg at Stalingrad. Years of combat had sharpened his tactical instincts to a razor's edge. But even Marx, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders, couldn't imagine the scale of what was coming. The German defenders had prepared for an invasion, sure, but they hadn't prepared for an industrial avalanche that would bury them under sheer material superiority. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, appointed as naval advisor to Rommel in November 1943, had spent months inspecting the coastal defenses. Born into a naval family in 1894, he understood maritime operations better than any other German officer in France. He'd begged for more mines, more obstacles, more guns. But as he later wrote in his memoir, Rommel's in Normandy, we were preparing to fight the last war. They were bringing the next one. Here's the thing. The German High Command had tricked themselves into thinking the Allies could only mount an invasion with maybe 20 divisions and 3,000 vessels. They based that on their own capabilities, their own limitations, Years of war had left them short on supplies and their industry exhausted. But on June 6, as dawn broke over Normandy, German observers in bunkers from Cherbourg to Le Havre started reporting the impossible. Not hundreds of ships, thousands. This wasn't a raid or a distraction. It was the largest amphibious invasion in human history. At Strongpoint WN-62, overlooking what would soon be known as Omaha Beach, 20-year-old Gerhard Heinrich so peered through his machine gun embrasure at 5:45 a.m. This farm boy from Mecklenburg had never seen the ocean before being stationed in Normandy. Now, he couldn't see the ocean at all, only steel. Ships everywhere, so later wrote in his memoir. Big ships, small ships, fat flat-bottomed ships, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs. The horizon was gone. I tried to count, but gave up at 100. There were thousands. Across the 50-mile invasion front, German officers and soldiers had the same shocking realization. They weren't just facing more troops, they were facing a whole different level of power. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment began. The Allied fleet had 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors. For the Germans, this was their first lesson in American industrial math. Take the USS Texas, for example. She fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the first hour. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds. In 60 minutes, one ship delivered 178 tons of high explosives, more than many German artillery regiments had in their entire ammo reserves. Before a single soldier set foot on the beaches, Allied naval forces had fired roughly 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships. That's about 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Commander-in-Chief West, later testified, "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories." At 6 a.m., as naval shells kept pounding the Atlantic Wall, the Germans got a second taste of Allied industrial superiority. The sky filled with aircraft, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties to support the landings, and they already had air supremacy. The Luftwaffe had only around 300 operational aircraft in all of France. On D-Day, they managed 319 sorties. The Allies? 14,674. That's 46 Allied planes for every German one in the air. The odds weren't just bad, they were absurd.
Major Joseph Prier, commanding Jacques Geschwader 26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion Beach that morning.
With just his wingman, Heinz Wudersick, he strafed Sword Beach once before fleeing from dozens of Allied fighters. This famous incident, documented in multiple history books, showed just how powerless the German Air Force was. Now, despite all this overwhelming firepower, some German defenders thought they might hold their ground. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division occupied great defensive positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach. Machine guns in concrete bunkers created interlocking fields of fire. The first waves of American infantry from the 1st and 29th Divisions walked right into a slaughter. When they hit the beach at 6:30 a.m., machine gun fire erupted from every resistance nest. Heinrich Severloh, manning an MG-42 machine gun at Widerstandsnister 62, fired over 12,000 rounds that morning. His own testimony confirms it. He watched American soldiers fall by the dozens, then the hundreds. Bodies floated in the surf. The beach turned red with blood. For a brief moment, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might hold. But then the destroyers came. Around 8 a.m., the situation at Omaha Beach was critical. General Omar Bradley was even considering evacuating. But then something unprecedented happened. American destroyers, ignoring the risk of running aground or hitting mines, closed in to within 1,000 yards of the beach. That's point-blank range for naval guns. The USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt turned their 5-inch guns on individual German strongpoints. At that range, they couldn't miss. Naval records prove this move was decisive in breaking the German defense at Omaha. This was the moment German officers started to understand what American industrial might really meant. It wasn't just the number of ships, it was the willingness to risk them, to use them as expendable tools. The USS Corrie was lost, but others immediately took its place. For the Germans, ships were precious, irreplaceable assets. But for America, they were just tools, and they had thousands more. As the morning went on, German observers saw something that defied everything they knew about amphibious operations. The landing craft just kept coming, wave after wave, hour after hour. It was like an endless conveyor belt of men and supplies flowing from sea to shore. The variety of specialized vessels stunned them. Landing craft tanks, LCTs, dropped 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the beaches. Landing ship tanks, LSTs, massive 328-foot-long ships, beached themselves and opened their bow doors to unload entire tank companies. DUKW amphibious trucks swam ashore, drove up the beach, and delivered supplies right to the combat units. By nightfall, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops, 132,715 by sea and 23,400 by air. That's more than the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. In the first 24 hours, they also landed 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. The German 7th Army had fewer than 500 operational tanks total. The Allies landed 3 times that many on day 1. The German response to the invasion showed not just material inferiority, but a total system breakdown in the face of overwhelming enemy power. The legendary panzer divisions, who'd conquered France in 6 weeks back in 1940, were paralyzed by Allied air supremacy and naval gunfire. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to intervene on D-Day, started its counterattack at 4 p.m. It took them 3 full hours to move just 10 miles from Rouen to Caen. What should have been a devastating armored attack turned into a tragic line of burning vehicles. When the surviving panzers finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they faced naval gunfire directed by forward observers. The HMS Warspite, watching from 15 miles offshore, fired 15-inch shells that could penetrate any tank ever built. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, later wrote in his memoirs, "The enemy's material superiority was so great that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock." On June 7, D-Day +1, German reconnaissance aircraft brought back photos that senior officers couldn't believe at first. The Allies weren't capturing ports, they were building harbors, right there in the open sea from nothing. The Mulberry harbors were industrial capability on a scale that was hard to wrap your head around. Prefabricated in Britain, these artificial ports used 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, and 93 ships deliberately sunk as breakwaters. Within 2 weeks, they were handling 9,000 tons of supplies every day, more than many French ports. The Germans had spent 4 years building the Atlantic Wall to protect their ports. The Allies just eliminated the need for ports entirely. Throughout June 1944, German commanders slowly realized how completely they'd failed at intelligence. The elaborate deception of Operation Fortitude had tricked German intelligence into thinking the Normandy landings were a distraction. They thought the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, led by Patton's fake 1st United States Army Group. For crucial weeks, German reserves stayed frozen, waiting for an invasion that never happened. General der Panzertruppe Leo Gere von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, figured out the deception when captured documents revealed Patton's real location, in Normandy, leading the very real Third Army. As June turned into July, German officers' reports to headquarters got more and more desperate. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, got a call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at OKW, demanding to know why the invasion hadn't been pushed back into the sea. When Keitel asked what should be done, Rundstedt famously replied, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" For telling the truth, he was immediately fired. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel met with Hitler on June 17 in Margeville, France. According to documented accounts, Rommel presented statistics that showed just how hopeless Germany's position was: complete Allied air supremacy, German divisions at only 30% strength, and no way to move during daylight because of naval gunfire. Hitler's response? Forbid any retreat, demand fanatical resistance. Rommel left that meeting knowing Germany was doomed. Within a month, he'd be implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler and forced to commit suicide. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, who survived the war, later wrote in Invasion 1944, Rommel and the Normandy campaign, "We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior strategy. We were buried under an avalanche of material." The battle for Caen showed just how useless German resistance was against Allied material superiority. On July 7, 467 RAF heavy bombers dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on Caen in 40 minutes, more explosive power than the entire Luftwaffe in France had. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's best units, entered the Normandy battle with 20,540 men and 150 tanks. After 6 weeks, they had just 300 men and no tanks, losing 8,000 soldiers in the Falaise Pocket alone. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy that started on July 25, was the final proof of Allied supremacy. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers dropped 3,300 tons of bombs in a concentrated carpet bombing attack, targeting an area just 6,000 by 2,200 yards. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer-Lehr Division, positioned right under the bombardment, reported, "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial complex." The Panzer-Lehr had entered Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 men. After the bombing, they simply vanished. Of the 3,000 men in the targeted area, 1,000 died instantly, 1,000 were wounded, and 1,000 were too psychologically shattered to fight. The operation had tragic friendly fire incidents: 111 Americans killed and 490 wounded, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in action in the European theater. But even these casualties didn't stop the operation from succeeding. The Falaise Pocket, from August 12 to 21, 1944, became the graveyard of German forces in Normandy. The numbers are staggering: 10,000 to 15,000 Germans killed, 40,000 to 50,000 captured, 344 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed just in the northern sector, 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles abandoned, and 252 artillery pieces lost. Between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans escaped the encirclement, but they were just disorganized remnants, not fighting units. The German General Staff couldn't wrap their heads around it. They weren't fighting a military campaign, they were fighting an industrial equation. Let's look at 1,944 production numbers to see the difference. Germany's 1944 production, 39,807 aircraft, a peak of 1,854 tanks per month in December, and 68,000 military trucks. America's 1944 production, 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and 650,000 military trucks. And these numbers don't even include British, Canadian, or Soviet production. Germany was fighting the entire world's industrial output with the capacity of a medium-sized nation, one that was getting bombed more and more. Total American wartime production is mind-blowing: 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. General Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff, calculated after the war that by 1944, the Allied advantage in war production was about 5-1. In some categories, like trucks, it was 10-1. We were not defeated, he said. We were mathematically eliminated. The German officers who survived Normandy were never the same. They didn't just witness a military defeat, they saw Nazi ideology proven wrong. The idea of German superiority and American weakness? It crumbled. Young officers who'd grown up under Nazism were hit especially hard. They'd been told Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury, unable to fight. Instead, they found Americans had machines to do the hard work, radios to coordinate, plenty of ammo to practice with, and confidence from unlimited support. The suicide rate among German officers spiked. Defeat was one thing, but having your entire worldview proven wrong? That's something else. Beyond just quantity, German officers faced a technology gap that showed how far behind they were. Proximity fuses turned anti-aircraft fire into precise killing tools. Radar-directed naval gunfire could hit targets miles inland with the first shot. DUKW amphibious trucks solved logistics problems Germany couldn't even imagine. The Allies' use of specialized vehicles really impressed the Germans. Hobart's funnies, modified tanks that could clear mines, lay bridges, and destroy bunkers, solved tactical problems with engineering, not bloodshed. Throughout the Normandy campaign, German officers grew to fear naval gunfire more than anything. The battleship HMS Rodney's 16-inch guns could fire 2,448-pound shells 23 miles inland. The USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite turned their main batteries into super-heavy artillery that could wipe out any target. German artillery trying to fire back at naval ships quickly learned it was useless. Ships moved, and they shot back hard. By July 1944, German forces could barely move during daylight. Allied fighter bombers operated in cab ranks, controlled by forward observers, so they could strike any target within minutes. The numbers are overwhelming: over 12,000 Allied aircraft in the theater, compared to 300 to 500 German ones. Allied sorties per day, 5,000 to 8,000. German sorties, 50 to 100, if they could manage it. Let's wrap up with the final stats from the Normandy campaign, June 6 to August 30, 1944. The Allies landed 2,522,999 personnel, 438,471 vehicles, and 3,982,590 tons of supplies. They flew over 480,000 aircraft sorties. German losses? 240,000 killed, 200,000 captured, 2,200 tanks and assault guns lost, and over 40 divisions destroyed. 10 years later, in 1954, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium on the Normandy campaign. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, who'd served as chief of staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge, gave the keynote address. "We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally," he said. "It was no longer a contest of armies, but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production." The image that haunts me still is the sight of American bulldozers pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks. The German officers who witnessed D-Day were permanently transformed. Many of these veterans did change. Hans Speidel became a NATO general, helping integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. Many Normandy veterans advocated for European economic integration, understanding that only by pooling resources could European nations hope to match American industrial capacity. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy, compared his experience to those in Normandy. "In Italy, we could fight the Allies on relatively equal terms. In Normandy, on open ground where they could deploy their full industrial might, our forces were simply erased." On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen returned to Crisbecq Battery as an honored guest. The former Oberleutnant, now 73, stood at the same observation post where he'd first seen the invasion fleet. Speaking to gathered veterans, both Allied and German, he reflected, "40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible. A sea covered with ships from horizon to horizon. I knew in that moment that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. Divided nations don't coordinate such an invasion. I fired my guns at that armada, and I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide. We sank one destroyer, damaged a few others. For every ship we hit, 100 passed unharmed." He went on, "Young officers today study tactics from Normandy. But the real lesson is simpler. In modern war, the side that can produce the most wins. We learned that industrial capacity is military capacity. The sea of ships I saw that morning was not just an invasion fleet. It was American industrial might made visible." The German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied ships approach on D-Day witnessed more than an invasion. They witnessed the future of warfare, where industrial capacity would matter more than anything else. That haunting image of the endless armada? It was democracy's hidden power unleashed, industrial might used for military purpose on a scale that made traditional military virtues irrelevant. The Germans had prepared for war, but they met the full industrial capacity of the United States instead. In that terrible moment of clarity, those German officers knew they were witnessing the end of war as they understood it, and the birth of something new. Industrial warfare on a scale that made their professional expertise obsolete. Their defeat wasn't military, it was mathematical. Not tactical. It was industrial. Not a failure of courage, it was a shortage of trucks. It's a lesson written in steel across the English Channel on June 6, 1944. Nearly 7,000 ships announced that American industrial might had come to Europe. And nothing would ever be the same again.